Warning: this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on today's show, where you will learn about media literacy, finding truth in journalism and the news cycle. My first guest is Professor Nolan Higdon. He is an author and university lecturer of history and media studies. Dr. Higdon's areas of concentration include youth culture, news media history, and critical media literacy. His most recent publications include United States of Distraction, co-authored with Mickey Huff, and The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education. He is also the co-host of Along the Line podcast with Dr. Dreadlocks, Nicholas Baham III, and a longtime contributor to Project Censored's annual book, Censored. Welcome, Nolan. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is a pleasure. This is a topic that I have been eager to jump into for a long time because we are just bombarded every day on every media platform that there is. And we know a lot of it is fake, but how do we as the consumer tend to whittle away and suss out what's real and what's not?
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, for about a decade or more, I've been studying, false news that masquerades as truth or as legitimate journalism. And it was only in recent years, largely because of Donald Trump's weaponization of fake news, that I started to get some attention. And it's been nice to see that folks are interested in this. And I think you hit the nail on the head that we need to recognize that fake news is everywhere. We can't, make lists of good news outlets versus bad news outlets. We can't pretend that fake news is somebody else's problem. It's everywhere. It's on all mediums, all platforms, alternative news, social media, so-called traditional news media. And unfortunately, we're in an environment now where we are, a mediated society. We're spending the majority of our day consuming media. Yet we don't really have the skills to kind of sift through media. So what I advocate for is for people to slow down, try and take in less content and spend more time with less content. Spend more time investigating each piece of content you come across. So we can get into a little bit of what that investigation looks like. But sort of my first piece of advice is slow down. Take less content, investigate it, and also remind yourself of why we have news in the first place. We live in a democracy, and the news is what's supposed to inform us of how to act and make decisions in our democracy. So it's not good to just click, like, and share every piece of news headline you see. You want to actually analyze it and go in depth with the content, because that's the way you can better inform yourself as a citizen.
Well, in the past, let's go back a few decades, the news was not the basis for advertising. And it seems to me that all of the modern news outlets, whatever side of the coin they're coming from, are really being propagated by advertisement, that they really are not delivering straight news, just the facts.
News media companies in the 20th century were threatened by the expansion of government, which took place in the beginning and middle of the 20th century. And they were afraid the government would become so big it would start regulating media. So journalists decided to regulate themselves. They created codes of ethics. Media outlets who produce entertainment also left time aside for news content. But at the end of the 20th century, we started to get a sensibility in this country that we needed to shrink government. We got rid of a lot of regulations. Like previously, there used to be a regulation on how many media outlets a company could own in a particular market. And fear of government intervention dissipated, monopolies emerged, and all of a sudden, news outlets were concerned with how much money they could make, not how informed the public was.
Well, I'm thinking of like Sinclair Media, for example. Like Sinclair Media owns, and you can elaborate better on this than myself, a lot of small media outlets that are pushing out the same scripted messaging.
Yeah, the goal of these companies is to maximize funding. And if they had a series of journalists working at each of those independent outlets, that would cost a lot of money. And a lot of what journalists do doesn't produce content right away. Like journalism takes time. You have to spend a lot of time cultivating sources and investigating, digging deeper. And there's not content produced out of that. So instead, they send scripts around and video releases around to all their different affiliates to fill time. It's the same thing we saw in the 24-hour news networks, right? They cut overseas bureaus in the 1990s. And then they started to cut small markets. If you weren't in a big city, you lost your journalists there in the early 21st century. They also don't report on weekends because they don't think enough people are watching TV. And so basically, if something happens that's not in a big market on a weekday, you don't know about it. And God forbid it happens overseas, you'll definitely never find out about it. And they've filled that time that they used to have, 24-hour news networks. They filled that time with sort of hyper-partisan talking points. MSNBC is good at rallying the Democrats and Fox is good at rallying the Republicans. And there was a gentleman who used to work for World Championship Wrestling named Eric Bischoff, who said that when he worked in pro wrestling, his job was to create good guys and bad guys and make the audience feel like they're with the good guy and that they were going to defeat the bad guy. And he said, now I look at 24-hour news, that's exactly what they're doing. They make them and their audience seem like the good guy and the other party is the bad guy.
And when we talk about fake news as being nothing new, we can go back in history before there was even TV and cite occasions where there was untruthful news being propagated for the gain of a certain party or cause.
Yeah, this is nothing new. I mean, we have this idea that the past was better, but that's simply not true. Regulations created more barriers for fake news producers, but fake news was still a pervasive problem. I mean, you can look back at the Vietnam War, how we got into that, and the public's interpretation of it was highly managed by members of our own government and defense corporations that were outright false. I mean, and more recently, you can look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the fake news leading up to that. Mm-hmm. And even sort of the speculative fake news after the 2008 economic collapse. A lot of that was trying to blame like independent homeowners and really ignored the Wall Street elements of it. So there's a long, history of fake news. In my book, I go back all the way to Christopher Columbus, where he says he is and what he says he found is fake news. So there's a long history of this.
Yes. When we talk about fake news threatening democracy, I think I agree with you. I think that it does. But explain to our listeners the reasons why. We need to hear it.
For sure. Democracy is a radical idea. It's predicated on the will of the people, that the majority of the people will make decisions that'll be the best decision for the country. And a lot of those decisions have implications for people in areas that we don't see or know. And journalists end up being the ones who tell us about those people in those areas. Journalists are the ones who tell us about our people in power. Is their ideology working? Are they doing a good job? Are they doing anything corruptly? Most of us will never get to go to Washington, D.C. and meet these people. We depend upon journalists. And that relationship is very strong. When we start conflating that relationship with legitimate journalism with fake news, then we become quite vulnerable because we can be manipulated to support things that are against our interests or take actions that are against our interests. I'll give you a prime example. I think hopefully the majority of your audience realizes that pedophilia is a bad thing and something we want to defeat.
I know where you're going.
Yeah. And so there was this fake news story going around the internet that Hillary Clinton and the Democrats had a pedophile ring in a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant, and they were covering it up. And this gentleman read about it. It's a fake news story, read about it online. And he drove up from North Carolina to this pizza restaurant and shot a gun. And the story was, kind of making fun of this guy and the problem of fake news. But I took a different point of view on the story, which was this individual had just gotten in-home internet shortly before he committed this shooting. And so it's illustrated how some of our best impulses, right, wanting to like free children from abuse, can be manipulated by false content to do something irrational and crazy, like shoot up a pizza restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a prime illustration of why we need to really have those media literacy skills to analyze content before we make decisions. Because had this individual analyzed the news story deeper, he could have went back and looked through the actual emails the articles were referencing and realized that the restaurant, pedophilia, none of this stuff was actually ever mentioned in the emails. But it takes that skill and it takes that know-how and will to go back and look at actual sourcing to not get duped by content like that.
Well, let's talk for a moment about critical thinking, because where was it written that critical thinking should go out the window? I mean, so is that some fake news? Like we should throw out our critical thinking and not think about reason, logic, accountability, and what just makes good sense?
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure put on schools starting in the 1980s. The Reagan administration had this so-called Nation at Risk study, which has its own set of problems.
Yes.
And so teachers were starting to get, critiqued for teaching the wrong things or being ideologically biased. And if you teach critical thinking, which I do, you have to be open to questioning anything. It's one of the first things you teach students. And that can lead us to a lot of controversial places. And because there was so much pressure on a lot of educators, many of them kind of balked at the opportunity. At the same time, there was a big push that we need to monitor our teachers and evaluate them. And so the standardized testing was created. We'll give all the students the same test. The test wasn't actually testing the students, it was testing the teachers. And multiple choice testing is not conducive to critical thinking. A critical thinker would look at the 4 choices and rather than pick one would say, this is stupid. There's probably more than 4 choices. So for those ways, we've kind of weeded out critical thinking in our education system. And I think you're right that, one of the things I advocate for is critical thinking across the curriculum. And, studies show that people who take rigorous critical thinking courses are less likely to get duped by fake news content.
Yeah. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, I'd love for you to give us some tips of ways that we can better deconstruct or analyze the media that we are seeing on all platforms. The book we're talking about today is The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education. My guest is Dr. Nolan Higdon. To connect with Nolan, do so on Twitter at Nolan_Higdon. You can also catch him on his own podcast, which he co-hosts, entitled Along the Line. We'll be right back, and that is a promise and a truth.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
And we are back talking about media literacy, finding truth in journalism, and the news cycle. My guest today is Professor Nolan Higdon. Let's get back to the conversation. Nolan, in the first segment, you really did a good job of explaining some of this, but I would love for you to give our listeners some tips in how we can really question what it is that we are seeing and reading.
Yeah, I think first it's helpful also to define fake news. So I define fake news any false or misleading content that is presented as legitimate news. And so when you approach any content that you think is legitimate, there's a lot of self-reflection you should do. One, you should ask yourself, do you want to be informed? Do you want to be an informed citizen? Or do you want to be a fake news disseminator? Because informed citizens are going to spend a lot more time analyzing. Fake news disseminators are just going to hit like and share. And then you also want to ask, should I react or should I investigate? A lot of fake news wants you to react. It plays to lower emotions of fear and hate. So don't fall for them. Slow down. Try to investigate the content rather than just react. Be aware and reflect upon your own biases. What is it that draws you to certain content? Is it that you want the content to be true? Is that why you're engaging with it? Do you engage with content you disagree with? The answer should be yes, you want to. But once you actually are looking at the content, ask some basic questions like, who is the publisher of the content? Does this publisher have a history of producing fake news? Is it like the Washington Post versus like news.com or something? And there's some websites like Media Matters or fair.org, Snopes, PolitiFact, Fact Check. They can help you, give you some indication of the history of the news outlet. But I also like folks to go deeper. Don't just familiarize yourself with news outlets, because there's been fake news producers who've worked at legitimate outlets, like the New York Times hired Jason Blair, who printed thousands of fake stories, or Judith Miller, who lied to get us into the Iraq War. So also pay attention to who the journalist is, and do they have a long history of credibility? Do they have any conflicts of interest? And start to follow journalists who aren't afraid to report stories, even if they disagree with kind of like the dominant thinking. And don't be afraid to cut out journalists who have a credibility issue. Like every time I turn on the TV, if I ever see Brian Williams, I know to turn the channel. This is a guy who lied about getting shot in a helicopter attack, right? True. So I turn that off. And then, I encourage people to also ask yourself, do I understand the content? Sometimes, especially like headlines, can be really misleading, and we think they say something they don't. Or the news content can be presented in a way where it insinuates something that it doesn't have evidence to back up. So really spend time to determine, what are they trying to say and how are they trying to prove it? You have to understand that before you can analyze whether or not they have evidence. And that's where you get to the sourcing. All news content should have multiple sources. They should be independent sources, meaning that they don't have conflicts of interest. Their information should be able to be verified by other sources. They should be a named source. I always encourage people to stay away from anonymous sources. There's been this, especially in the last like 4 years, anonymous sources have actually written books now. You should never, anonymous sources should almost never happen, in short. And then also, are they authoritative or informed source? I'm always kind of amazed at these folks who are able to sound like experts, but everything they're saying is completely wrong. So make sure they actually are authorities on the topic. And then I would wrap up with just a couple other things. You also want to notice what's missing from the content. So if it's like a corporately funded news outlet, compare it to like an independently funded news outlet. So what's that same story in an independently funded outlet? And projectcensor.org does a good job of delineating those. If it's like a right-leaning outlet, check the same story in a left-leaning outlet. Allsides.com has a good chart on that. And then also look at like who is represented, what like identity groups, what racial groups, is it women or men? Who gets to tell these stories? Who's treated as a newsworthy source? Because sometimes if we're missing those different identity groups, we fail to see it through a racialized lens or a gendered lens. And so especially those of us with privilege, we have blinders on to how these stories are told. And then lastly, the last thing I tell people is make sure it qualifies as journalism. Are they actually out reporting? Are they investigating? Do they have sources? Do they have a code of ethics? If the answer is no, those are all probably good indications it's fake news.
I think you've said something very important that I want to circle back to and highlight, and that is the privileged perspective. There are certain family members in my life who shall remain nameless for the sake of family peace on this podcast, but have a set of beliefs that certain things are not real. Racial inequality is not real. And no matter where I point those people to in terms of sources, they are just not having it. There's just not a buy-in because of their experience. And I think, how would you suggest that we speak to family members and friends and colleagues that come from this very tunnel visioned, skewed approach to the world, and they believe themselves to be so informed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually get this question a lot, and I first answer it with what not to do. And I think calling people names,
telling them they're stupid, not a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Mocking them, labeling them. It may make you feel good, but historically it doesn't do well in getting folks to kind of open up their understanding. I think you have to kind of walk very, very gently. Privilege comes with a certain fragility. Privilege means that we're afraid we're being attacked. So reminding these folks that this isn't an attack on you personally, right? It's an analysis of larger structures in society. And fake news is equally irresponsible in maintaining a lot of those stories. I go back in the book to show how patriarchy and white supremacy relied on fake news content to convince audiences to uphold these structures. So I think taking a much gentler approach with people, and this has had success. I point to like Daryl Davis, who's a African-American musician who's spent a lot of his life talking to KKK members and convincing them to leave the Ku Klux Klan, and he collects their robes when they leave.
Wow.
And if he's a black person engaging with that much hate and having success, the rest of us, that should give us a lot of hope.
This was a really good story. Daryl Davis. I'm going to check that out. But let's talk about the element of fear. We're nearly out of time, and there were two more points I wanted to talk about. One is, when we come from this place of fear, how vulnerable we are to the fake news. And secondly, to emphasize how fake news is a bipartisan problem. Yeah,
fake news has always been a bipartisan problem, and no one should be shocked that politicians lie. Politicians are responsible for a lot of the fake news content. Yeah, I know, right? I hope your audience was sitting down. But right now, just picking two sort of stories, a lot of Democrats have been using baseless claims about Russia. There are some actual claims, but they've been using a lot of baseless claims to promote fear against the quote unquote other side. And meanwhile, Republicans, are using things like the QAnon conspiracy and things like this to promote fear about the quote unquote other side. And, it's worth, reflecting on a lot of that speculative reporting before the election of, supposedly like an authoritarian regime was going to be put in place and democracy was going to die. And in reality, votes were put up, votes were counted. Trump refuses to concede, but, meanwhile, Joe Biden is putting together like a committee and the country's moving on. So a lot of that fear that was pumped up wasn't really delivered upon. And in that way, I always say, analyzing Trump's presidency, that Trump his rhetorically was very dangerous and scary, but he was really inept and ineffective. And so we should really kind of analyze him in reality, but there was so much fear sort of pumped in, and ultimately I think it put us in a poor state that made it impossible to talk to the quote unquote other side.
Well, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, though, that things will change. We're in another situation in terms of the pandemic, and there's fear around that. When many of us are holed up in our homes, we're spending a lot more time in front of the TV or whatever source we get our news from. And we have to kind of undo some of this mess because the pandemic's not going away anytime soon, right? We're going to have to contend with that until a vaccine comes along that, the majority of us can take. And is there fake news around that?
Absolutely. You can't deny that Americans' denial of science is closely tied to these fake news stories that have supposedly said that, scientists and politicians are fabricating numbers and fabricating deaths, et cetera, to get us all locked in our home. But it's also important to understand that the reason why that fake news is so effective is a lot of folks who believe it have been screwed in one way or another by the system. And so they come to believe that elites could be this vicious to them. And so I think it opens up a lot of, sort of uncomfortable areas where you have to simultaneously feel bad for folks who've been screwed by the system, but also try and rectify the way they've engaged with this false content.
Yeah, just put on your dang mask, wash your hands, and, behave like any good 5-year-old in the play yard,
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a lot of that, but also, just in all things being fair, that when we shut down the economy for folks like me, I get to teach from home and earn my salary, and I own a home. But for a lot of other people, they shut down the economy and no money was sent out to them. So the situation for them is pretty dire.
It's dire. Exactly.
Yeah. And they feel like these elites in Washington don't care about them. And it makes you more likely to believe that, I don't know, maybe they're fabricating COVID, or whatever.
And fear has one in a places one in a state of being willing to surrender to force. When we're so fearful, we will do anything to be saved from that fear or what it is that we think could happen. And that's my concern. Like if you look at governments, if you go, I mean, this is a whole other podcast episode, but when you go and you look at the 4 years of the Nazi regime and what was done, and I'm going out there with Hitler and to manipulate the media, then there's some smell of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I cover that in the book as well, the close connection between fake news and authoritarian regimes. And I use Hitler as an example. This gets back to my sort of Trump analogy, though, that if Trump, really wanted to put in an authoritarian regime, I think COVID was a prime opportunity. But he showed his own ineptitude at being an authoritarian. However, having said that, I would be frightened in the future because there does seem to be a hunger for an authoritarian-like figure amongst our citizenry. So even though Trump is inept, that doesn't mean that hunger has gone away.
That's true. And that there's not somebody who's younger, smarter, more polished, more subtle in his or her manipulation that's just waiting in the wings of either party. I don't think it's particularly one side or the other. I mean, I think it's human nature's lust for power and control.
Yeah. And, that was one of the things about that I write about in the book was that the fear and panic over Trump and right-wing fake news was so pervasive, and that, liberals were willing to compromise on things like censorship, for example, and work with like tech companies who have contracts with the government. So it's censorship by proxy, to censor content. I think that's kind of a dangerous road to go down when we start trading civil liberties for perceived like electoral victories, because, our civil rights are dependent upon us defending them. And so if we're giving up civil liberties to win elections, we're not really winning anything.
We're out of time. And I think the departing challenge to the listener is to do your homework, to take the information in and to take a little bit deeper dive, scratch beneath the surface, be curious, question, compare, look for statistics and real information beneath the headline. I mean, I think that's what I gleaned from what you're saying.
Yeah, truth is out there. It's just, surrounded by a bunch of falsehoods. So you can find it, but it takes time and it takes effort. And I have, a lot of faith in the American people that if they take that time and effort, they'll find it.
I agree. I do have faith, and that's a good thing. Dr. Nolan Higdon, thanks for joining us on the show. To hear more about Nolan's work and opinions and research, go visit Along the Line podcast, where he co-hosts with Dr. Dreadlocks and Nicholas Bayham III. The book we've been speaking of today is The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education. And go out and be curious. Thanks, Nolan.
Thank you.
Here comes that pause. We'll be right back. And that is a guarantee.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
And we are back, continuing the conversation about media literacy, finding truth in journalism, and that 24/7 news cycle. My next guest is John O'Connor. He is the author of Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. John O'Connor is an experienced trial lawyer practicing law in San Francisco since 1972. He has tried cases in state and federal court throughout the country. He served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Northern California from 74 through 79, representing the United States in both criminal and civil cases. Among his interesting assignments have been representation of the government during the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s, writing Fifth Amendment and state of mind briefs for the prosecution of the United States versus Patricia Hearst, and representing W. Mark Felt regarding the revelation of his identity as Deep Throat. And I have to say, John O'Connor, welcome to the show, and thank you for being such an interesting and engaging guest. I'm so excited about what we're going to talk about.
Well, I'm excited too, Lisa. This is fun, and I like the format of your show because I think you're trying to get at sort of the same place that I'm trying to get by doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Get a little bit of the kernel of the truth out there and maybe a little bit of education to boot. Brain food.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. And maybe we can get to the truth, figure out how to do it.
Yes, that is my hope, at least a complexion of the truth. Let's talk a little bit about Postgate, because this is a very intriguing book, and we are rewinding the tapes of history here. But for our listeners, just give a brief synopsis of the book so we know where the starting point is and how Watergate sort of laid the groundwork as a point of reference for what we are experiencing now.
Well, first, let me start, Lisa, with Watergate. I think everybody would say, and certainly all journalists would say, that was a turning point in modern journalism. Investigative reporting became big. Sort of sensationalism became big. The news on television used to be a half an hour nightly deal, and now it's a bigger all-day thing. And newspapers are much more politically out front, I would say, than they used to be. And it all started with Watergate, and my client, Mark Felt, was the number 2 man in the FBI. They called him Deep Throat in Watergate lore because he came into the garage. He met Bob Woodward in the garage several times to try to help Woodward understand what was going on and report it correctly. And Mark Felt's hope was that if the public knew both sides of things, that they would not just sweep Watergate under the rug, as had been the case up till then. He did not think that that Watergate was correctly perceived by the public, and he also knew that the FBI's investigation was being restricted, and he wanted to keep his FBI from being seen as part of the problem. He wanted to do the full deal and get everything out on the table. And that's how this strange marriage between an older FBI man and a younger reporter meeting in a garage at nighttime, how it all came about. So I was at the time a young prosecutor in San Francisco when All the President's Men, the book, came out, and then the movie. Was fascinated because it's exactly what I was doing. I was prosecuting white-collar crime and was interested in the interplay of this, and I wanted to figure out who this man was. I thought he was probably a hero. I think I understood what he was doing, and I thought he was I understood he was probably part of the justice system trying to make it clean. He wasn't a partisan. He was not a partisan, and that's part of the message I want to sort of get out today. He was a conservative Democrat, but liked Richard Nixon, but he didn't like the cover-up of Watergate. So now I got interested in this, knew he was Deep Throat. Mark, I just had thought about it. And finally I thought, this guy is Mark Felt. And finally I got to meet him in 2002. I found out one of my daughter's best friends was his grandson. And I said to him,
wow.
Let me come up and talk to your grandfather, Nick. He's Deep Throat. I know it. And Nick said, of course, he's always denied it. I said, I know he's denied it, but let me come up and talk to him because I think I know what I can say to him to get him to come out, because I think he's a hero and I don't think people understand him. So long story short, I'm getting maybe out on my skis here, but long story short, I went up and talked to him. And when I assured him that I and other youngsters in the Justice Department thought that this fellow Deep Throat was a hero that preserved our system so that we could truly have a nonpartisan, truthful, objective system, I thought I'd let him out of jail. You looked at his eyes, and there were these beautiful blue eyes. He seemed to melt. And his daughter, who was at the time 60 years old, his grandson, maybe 20, they both just were amazed. Gee, Granddad is Deep Throat. You can tell by his reaction to John's questioning. And that's when it began. It took us a few years to get him okay with talking, to convince somebody, because Mark had dementia, to convince him that I was right, that he was Deep Throat. Nobody believed me, even though I thought I could prove it. So anyway, I wrote a book back in 2006, and in the course of that, I started looking at the Washington Post reporting on Watergate and started studying it. And I realized that maybe the Post itself was not. I mean, we know Nixon was not telling the truth. We know the Republicans were not telling the truth. But then I looked at this and I said, well, the Post was covering some things up. They weren't exactly truthful themselves. And at the time, and not back in 1972 to 74, there was no news. There were no news shows, no all news networks, and there were not even other papers covering Watergate. It was started out as a local Washington, D.C. story. Anyway, the whole Post reporting shook the nation. It was very exciting for people, one way or the other, because of the Post reporting and the sensationalism that it caused. People felt, and I felt, that Nixon had to go. I felt the Post had proved their case, and they did to some degree. It was actually, I don't want to say it wasn't good reporting. Part of the reporting of the Post in Watergate was wonderful. Part was not. It was concealed. 2/3 of what Watergate was about was concealed, or maybe 1/2 was concealed, and 1/2 was revealed, and it got Nixon correctly. So I'm not suggesting that Nixon was not guilty in Watergate, but I'm suggesting that the whole truth did not come out, so that the public did not really judge the thing in its fullness. And the only time a president has been driven out of office in our republic, and we did not get all the facts. And so one of the things you and I had been talking about offline here, Lisa, was the fact that we can't talk to one another anymore, and things have gotten so partisan.
Yeah.
And even in my own family, we have trouble talking to one another. And I have a wonderful, wonderful family. It's the mainstay of my life, and yet we have trouble talking to one another. And
about politics, about politics, yeah.
About politics, anything that touches on politics, we're wonderful until anything gets close to politics. And I have my own immediate family are all. Actually, my sister's a good friend of the Obamas. My brother-in-law's a good friend of the Obamas. And my immediate family is very liberal. I've got a lot of cousins. We have many, many cousins, and many of those are as Trumpy as Trump can be. And it's sort of not. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book Postgate was because I decried this so much. I didn't like the fact that we are not nice to one another anymore. We cannot discuss our differences well, and it's almost civility. We don't have to all agree on everything, but can't we do this more civilly? And so part of the reason I wrote this book, it took me 9 years to research it. I read every Post article during Watergate, and I hope I can start a dialogue with the understanding that some people may read my book and think, oh, this is a partisan book. Well, I've tried to write it in a nonpartisan fashion and just get to the facts. And I have admiration for Woodward and Bernstein and what they did. They're energetic young reporters, and I said that. I don't blame them. I think their editors decided that for various reasons they couldn't tell the whole story. But that is what this is about, and I think there's a broader message I'm trying to get across. Now I'll stop talking for a moment, Lisa, because I think I've been going on for about 4 hours and 32 minutes here.
Well, I think you bring up a very, very important point, that sort of the age of civility feels as though it has gone, although I do believe that what America is undergoing at this moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, that there is an opportunity with the great pause and what I hope to be even the greater reset for this climate of civility to return, where we're curious and interested in what the other is thinking and seeing and believing. And maybe that is the kernel or the core of what you and I are talking about, what we spoke about offline, and what we're talking about now is this space of critical thinking that feels like it's non-existent.
Right. It is not there these days. And my job, as we had discussed, I've been a lawyer for 48 years, and my job is critical thinking, because if I simply uncritically accept what my client tells me, I would not be a very good lawyer.
Yeah.
I have to help my client. Yeah.
That makes me laugh, but it's the truth. That is the truth.
Yeah. It's like somebody asked me, what's the hardest part of your job? I said, it's cross-examining my client, Now, come on now, Bob, do you really mean that? I know you want to win this case, but let's think about what it is you really think and all what really happened here.
John, let's take a pause and let's come back and we'll talk about the questioning and critical thinking as it applies to your client and one another. To learn more about John O'Connor and his work, please visit www.joclaw.com. On Facebook, that page is John.D. O'Connor. The book we're speaking about today is Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back, and that is the truth.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life. A boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit HarvestingHappiness.com to learn more.
We are back talking about media literacy, finding truth in journalism, and that crazy 24-hour news cycle. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest today, John O'Connor. We're talking about the quest for the truth in the media and how, as individuals and citizens, we can become more discerning through the activation of critical thinking. And John, I'd love for you to share how you think we should do it, because I scratch my head at times.
Well, there's no substitute for hearing the other side in a respectful way. And how we get there, if I could bottle it and sell it, I'd be a very wealthy man. But let me give you an example in my experience in mediation. Mediation of lawsuits started in earnest in the 80s, late 80s, I suppose, and now almost every suit gets mediated. But over the years, over 48 years, I've settled thousands of cases. And it's important, if you're going to do a good job for your client, that you hear what the other person says, because then you can really, number one, you can evaluate what the jury's going to hear. Number two, if there's something, a weakness in your case, you can change it. You can realize that, well, maybe fact X is there. And it comes from listening to the other side, because at the end of the day, you're going to get an objective fact finder there that you've got to answer to. Now, that's not true in our society right now. There isn't an objective fact finder out there that you have to conform your thinking to. But so how do we get someone to listen? And I'll tell you this, one of the things that's happening today is, to get back at the problem, now, and if you talk to mediators today, they will say that litigants come in and they're so angry as it is, and the lawyers maybe aren't as experienced as they used to be because nobody tries cases anymore. They will come in and they will be so angry at one another that the mediator will almost never have a joint session, as you often do in mediations. They'll go to their separate corners and never see one another. I've now been in mediations where I'm not allowed to see the other party. I want to hear the other party. It's amazing. I will go through a mediation and maybe at the end of the day, I'll go shake a guy's hand that was been sitting in a room. Isn't that terrible? And I will say to the mediators, listen, I'd like to hear the other side. I've told my client, I want the other side to come in there and tell me everything. Give it to me right between the eyes. And then I'll understand where he's coming from. And I'll understand, and maybe I can change him too. Besides him changing me, I can change him where I think he's gone wrong. I'll say, listen, Mr. X, here's where I think you're gone wrong, and here's why I think the jury's going to buy this fact anyway. In this part of our case, you've got to acknowledge this. Oh, yeah, maybe you're right. That's the way it often happened in the old days. If you have experienced people, experienced lawyers guiding their clients to do that. And we need more people. And I think perhaps as we're talking now, maybe it's the people that are sort of opinion leaders, I would say, like you, people that other people listen to tell them, listen, it's not good. It's not good no matter what side of the coin you're on. It is not good to not listen to the other side. It is not good to be disrespectful. And if we can get that idea across, maybe that will lead to critical thinking. You know, we had talked before, the country, when founders were talking about the Constitution, one of the things James Madison said was, liberty is to factionalism or mobocracy, as oxygen is to a flame. It is necessarily in a democracy, people are going to get heated up. They're going to get factional. They're going to get excited like a mob. And he said the real remedy for that is exposing the truth, exposing all sides of the truth. And he hoped that would happen because at the time there was a multiplicity of newspapers and pamphlets on every corner. And that with the free press that was unfettered, we can cure or at least tamp down the effects of factionalism. Today, unfortunately, our media realizes they're going to sell a lot more product if they get in their emotional mob in their corner buying their product. And so the media is no longer helping, is my version of this.
Well, I agree with you. I think that for myself, I love news. I love news from all different places. And in order for me to understand what's going on, I actively look for sources that are not obvious. And I'm not talking about sort of fake news, social media channels, but you know, going and finding other outlets around the world, see what Canada has to say, see what Britain has to say, see what Australia has to say, see what Al Jazeera has to say, because they are representing different facets of this whole three-dimensional chess game that we find ourselves in.
Right. And then the second step is, so of course, the fact that you do that means that you're already thinking critically. So you are doing that so that you can then compare what they say to what you might think or might have heard elsewhere. That's basic critical thinking. And how do we get there? How do we get more people into your frame of mind where we are looking to the other side, the way I look to my opponents in a lawsuit? How do we get people into that frame of mind? And I think if there is something that needs to be brought out strongly, is not red versus blue. It's thinking, and looking at the other side. And if that idea will just put out there more, so that people would then maybe get a little sense of shame if they're not listening to somebody. If somebody starts yelling about he loves Trump or he hates Trump, it doesn't matter. If you feel a little bit ashamed that you're not thinking about what the other person might think.
I'm very curious why people love or hate Trump or any political figure. And I think that, you know, being in a state of active curiosity and being willing to ask questions and tolerate answers that might not align with your own thoughts, it is part of critical thinking. But moreover, one of the things that astounds me is the fact, here's a fact. If you ask somebody who is a political opponent, somebody who believes completely differently from you, what they value most in their lives, their top 3 or top 5 responses are going to be identical to yours in a different order.
Correct. Absolutely. You've hit it on the head. And that's why I think one of the unfortunate things, and I'm somewhat right-leaning in my philosophy, but I got to say that the way Trump is, and the reason Trump sells today, is the same thing I'm telling you about lawsuits. Now, today, some people think their lawyer's a good lawyer if he comes into a mediation yelling and screaming. Oh, boy, I got a good lawyer. He's a bulldog. He's a bulldog. No, I want to say that guy's yelling and screaming. He's not being a good lawyer for it because he's not going in. Number one, he's not hearing what the other person says. And number two, he's alienating the other side, and you could be converting the other side. I wish Trump were better because he's losing what I call the college-educated women vote, i.e. my wife. And I would like more people to think of sort of high-minded conservative, I call them conservative, I would call them free market, classical liberal thinking is where I'm coming from. Free markets, free ideas, free commerce. But I would like somebody to sell that better for me.
Some branding.
Not selling it. He's not, I want some branding.
Yeah.
I want some branding for this. I want to go back to, the philosophers back in 1790, but we can't do it. And so this sort of thing does drive us apart. So when people tell me they don't like Trump, I understand it. And I try to diffuse them. I say, I understand that. There are good reasons for you not to like Trump and the way he appears and the way he talks. But let's now talk about something else. Let's now talk about what you care about here. And I try to get around it that way because they have every reason and every right to be upset at the guy.
Yeah.
And a matter of fact, and a lot of the reasons people like Trump is because they're tired of being talked to by the other side. Maybe not in as vulgar a way as Trump does, but maybe in a condescending, pontificating, smug way. They feel somebody's telling them that they're these unwashed, ignorant people. How can you believe the way you're believing? You're just not cool. And that's very insulting to them. And when Hillary Clinton talks about deplorables, that's exactly. So there are people over there saying, yeah, that's what these people think about us. They think we're deplorable.
I hear
because
it.
We like family and we go to Baptist church on Sunday and they think we're terrible because, well, guess what? We're not. So somehow we have to get people into that point of view that it is just procedurally, it's not good to just shout out your views without listening and without thinking and without adopting and agreeing to those things that the other side says that are not disagreeable.
In my experience, the most powerful communication skill that a person can possess is shutting one's mouth and listening more.
Right. Right. Oh, no. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things, and I don't like a lot of the things Obama did politically, but I read about him in law school, and one of the reasons he got everybody's confidence in law school and he was elected to everything was he would sit there and listen to you. And people said everybody thought Obama agreed with him because he was listening to them. And
yes.
I think about it, it's a wonderful, wonderful political skill to nod your head. And also, when somebody says 5 things and you agree with 2 of them, make sure you let the person know you agree with those 2 of them.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. You're not there to fight. You're not there to fight. You're there maybe to do something else, to interrelate and exchange. And maybe we can get better for it. But I think our opinion leaders, we need to be stronger in letting people know that it's not about some of it is about form over substance, about the form of our discussion, about the form of our analysis and thinking.
The delivery, like how the tone and the attitude and the way we are approaching one another is harsh. It's difficult.
Yeah, tell everybody I think you just said it. Tell everybody to listen more. Yeah. Listen and nod. Listen and nod. And then say some things.
And tell somebody, I hear you. I mean, what a gift to feel that you're seen, heard, and understood. Like for me, that just like floats my boat. When I feel that somebody has really gifted me their attention, albeit for a minute or 2, I think, wow, that person was really interested. That makes me feel good.
That makes you feel good. And on the other hand, when you get tremendously adverse reactions, sometimes you feel that person is saying, you're not a good human being.
Yes.
You're not a good person. And that's not a good thing to do. The message should be, I think you're a wonderful human being. And I hear what you say, and I disagree with points 2 and 3, and that makes people feel better. And now you're starting to communicate.
And communicate and have critical thinking and all the things that we talk about that will lead us, hopefully, to a better place in the coming years ahead. Thank you, John O'Connor, for being with me. To learn more about John's work and his book, Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and began today's partisan advocacy journalism. Please go to John O'Connor's website, joclaw.com. On Facebook, he is at John.D.O'Connor. John, come and hang out with me anytime. I love this conversation.
Lisa, I think we're hitting on something, so it's been a blast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, here comes the break.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen and my guests, Professor Nolan Higdon and John O'Connor, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Remember to stay safe and go out and rock your day.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen. Harvesting Happiness is produced in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.